Hi, Vanessa. I'm glad you're here. I'm excited that we get to talk about your book today. And so, my first question is, where did the idea or the inspiration for your book, Convents and Novices in Early Modern English Dramatic Works in Media Res, come from? Well, that's a long, that's a
It
long
is,
title.
it's a long title, and I can tell you how that all came about some other time. So this is a book that's based on my dissertation. And so it actually, the sort of short version of the story is that it came out of me taking coursework at UC Davis, University of California, Davis. And I was in a class that was focusing on stories about and by women, and I was teaching Shakespeare at the same time. And so the text that I was reading started to create patterns for me as I was reading. I don't know, like you probably, when you're reading, you start to find patterns and you get excited about them.
Yeah.
So I was reading Afra Ben's play, The Rover, which is now my final chapter of the book, at the same time that I was teaching one of Shakespeare's lesser known plays, Measure for Measure. And they both have novice figures, women who are on the verge of becoming nuns, whether they want to or not. And by the end, they're sort of faced with different choices, right? Do they want to get married? And those are the sort of limitations that are set on the women. And so I was really interested in those sort of patterns, and specifically in the ways that they were on these thresholds, right? There were all sorts of doors, there were all sorts of entryways that could lead to trouble or that could lead to different statuses, right? And they both have sort of problematic endings. In Measure for Measure, the woman who wants to become a nun is proposed to by this patriarchal figure, and the implication is that she of course has to say yes. And at the end of The Rover, she actually takes some agency, right? The woman proposes to the man, but again, marriage is sort of the end point. And so I sort of was looking for places of agency where we can see resistance. So in Shakespeare's play, there's no real answer from Isabella the novice. And so I have a lot of arguments about what performance could entail and what that could allow her. But it was really, sort of my feminist approach of trying to imagine these sort of erased moments of agency, right? We have this play, but they're both meant to be performed. And so what are the options for the actors on the stage in these sort of fictions, but also then compared to an audience who might be watching this play, right? So during the time period that I'm writing, Catholicism is outlawed in England. And so I was really interested in like, why these Catholic figures, why convents, and what is that doing productively? So that's sort of where it came out of my research and my scholarship as a graduate student. I think more broadly, I was drawn to these figures because I was raised Catholic. I had friends who grew up in former convents that had become houses, and that's another sort of through line in my book where I find all these spaces that have been converted. So convents that are converted to mansions and vice versa. And so I'm just really interested in what those structures and what these sort of remnants of Catholicism are doing during a time when it's a really fraught political and religious landscape.
That's super interesting. And it's funny that you mentioned Measure for Measure, because when I took Shakespeare as an undergrad, I believe we did actually read that.
Yay.
Um, I hate to say it, but Shakespeare wasn't really my favorite course.
Okay, that's okay.
But I also think that has a lot to do with the teaching method in there, so unrelated. But I do think it's interesting because I know you mentioned that a lot of, like, one of the reasons that you were initially drawn to it was because of your personal experience and your background. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to me because you're not the only academic I've talked to that said that about the research area. So it's interesting that like the more and more people I talk to, the background plays a lot of role in the things that you end up studying.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it speaks to what you're drawn to as a reader. And some of it does tend to be personal experience, right? Something that you relate to, or conversely, something that you
Mhm.
find so foreign that you're like, what is this? And so, yeah, for me, I grew up in a little Catholic town in the middle of Minnesota, which is largely Lutheran, right?
Mhm.
And so we had this sort of little Catholic enclave, and it was part of my culture really growing up. And so I was just fascinated to find these figures that weren't fully being demonized, because during the time period, it's mostly anti-Catholic sentiment, right? They're evil, convents are
Right.
dens of, ill doing. And so to have them show up in ways that were unexpected was interesting to me. And I think it just tapped into something that from my past that I decided I wanted to continue to study.
Definitely interesting for sure.